of social change isn't just as easy and neat as these early theorists would have had us think. So Elman Service, in the early 20th century, came up with one of these ladder-like motifs that we still kind of use these terms today: bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. And these are levels of social organization that control different modes of production. But Charles Redman, slightly later, sort of mid-20th century, proposed that maybe the connections between these wasn't ladder-like, but was ramp-like. And maybe you could go backwards. Can you go from a chiefdom to a tribe, or a state to a band? Maybe if there's some huge upheaval where you have to abandon, if there's a giant 200-year drought and the cities start crumbling, what do? Well, you've got to pick up all of your stuff, and you've got to become maybe mobile. You've got to move around. We saw this even in the United States in the Dust Bowl. You had people moving around, homeless, looking for new jobs. It was a real crisis. And so even though our political organization went from state, continued as a state, people's individual social organizations went from one sort of organization into another. So these frameworks that we use, one really great social theorist that I've talked about before, one of my heroes, his picture's here, and his students loved him. They gave him a bear. I've got a picture here of Archeo Bear, where Gordon Childe is holding a bear that his students gave him. Very nice. Gordon Childe was a Marxist. He was actually a communist. He ran for office in his native Australia. He taught at my alma mater, University of Edinburgh, for many years, and he's actually the first professor of archaeology ever. He was the Abercrombie Chair at the University of Edinburgh, the first established archaeological position that wasn't part of a classics department or a history department or something like that. And he was influenced by Karl Marx's historical materialism, that he saw these connections between the means of production and the modes of production. But he actually put his finger on some major changing points in the past. Now, he was very knowledgeable of a lot of things. And he was able to sort of stand above so much information and look sort of top down and look at this mosaic that I've been talking about, this picture, and he could see the picture and the change through time. And he was mostly looking in Europe and the Middle East and Africa and a little bit of Asia, but the lessons that he taught could be applied to anywhere, because, as I've mentioned before, the difference between prehistory and history are not a time. It's whenever that takes place in that particular location. So what's the change from prehistory into history in North America? Well, it's 1491 to 1492. That was the change from prehistory into history, because writing didn't exist in North America until Europeans came in with their imported system. So Gordon Childe saw some major, as he called them, revolutions. And those terms are clearly coming from Marxism. Karl Marx was an activist and saw history moving through revolutions. Those terms, revolution, have been critiqued since Childe. But what has not really been overturned is that he's put his finger on some very major turning points. And I say turning point, but it can be a long, slow roll. And there's different discussions about how fast this pace of change was taking place. But nobody disputes that his designation of what was called the Neolithic Revolution and the Urban Revolution are still studied by archaeologists as huge turning points in human history. The Neolithic Revolution is also sometimes called the Agricultural Revolution. This is the moment in time when the first people started to, stopped moving around in the landscape, settled down in one place, and started to domesticate plants and animals. We're going to have a lot of discussion about this. We're going to have a whole chapter on this, and we're going to talk a lot more about the Neolithic Revolution. The other one is the Urban Revolution, which is the period of time when states started to form. So not just little local communities that were organizing themselves, but real top-down hierarchical systems of government, politics, society that created a differentiation in terms of wealth and power. We still live in the consequences of both of these things. We live in a domesticated world, which is the consequence of the Neolithic Revolution, and we live in states, which is the consequence of the Urban Revolution. Now, does everybody live in a domesticated space? No. There are still hunting, gathering, mobile, and semi-sedentary communities out there, and those are very interesting to anthropologists and archaeologists to study. Also, does everybody live in a state-level society? No, they don't. But that's the important point, is that there was a certain point when these changes started to take place in different locations. So the Neolithic Revolution, or the Agricultural Revolution, shifting from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, is something that took place independently at least 7 times around the world. And so that was at different locations. It was taking place at different times with different types of animals and plants and social organization. But it did happen. And so we saw states rise out of a domesticated space from the Neolithic Revolution in multiple places. So the Neolithic Revolution creates conditions by which the Urban Revolution can take place. And then eventually we also have things like the Industrial Revolution, but we're not really going to talk about that in this course. So this historical materialism that Karl Marx promoted was used by archaeologists to create what we call culture history. I talked a little bit about culture history in the last chapter, so I'm not going to go too far into that. And because Gordon Childe could stand above all of this information that existed at his time, he could actually see connections. He's like, oh, that's been influenced by that, And see, this is what we call diffusionism. And he was a big proponent for diffusionism. And in some cases, he was right. Like, for instance, the Neolithic Revolution in Europe didn't really happen. The domesticated plants and animals that you find in Europe in the Neolithic period are the product of immigrants and influencers coming from the Middle East, where it was independently invented. So Europe didn't invent their own agriculture and domestication of plants and animals, or sedentism. It was borrowed from the Middle East. And so that's what diffusion is. You have these waves of people moving in or influence moving into a new territory. But sedentism and domestication in China or in Mesoamerica is independent of what happened in the Middle East. So that's a case where China did not get diffused Middle Eastern invention of agriculture. They did it on their own, and that was independent. So diffusionism has its limitations. After Gordon Childe, you have some other theorists, and a lot of people were trying to make their name by saying, this is the thing that causes social change. I've got it, I've nailed it, this is it, so let's just look for that. Problem is, nothing's monocausal in our world, in our lives. Everything is connected. There's always various factors that go into creating complex systems. One of these theorists that started to sort of really push what demographic theory, which is, the sort of populations of people, was Robert Carnero. And there's something to it. There's something really compelling about his idea. He called it the circumscription theory, that in areas of circumscribed agricultural land, population pressure led to warfare that resulted in the evolution of the state. So he was looking at the transition from the Neolithic Revolution to the urban revolution, and he saw that once people start settling down, population starts to increase because there's surplus agriculture, and you benefit by having more children because then you have more laborers to work the land. This is all very straightforward. And that increasing population pressure puts pressure on the resources, which then will cause conflicts like warfare, that then you need a state-level organization to protect your territory. Great idea. But nothing's ever that simple. You had some other theorists like Karl Wittfogel, had what he called the hydraulic hypothesis, which was similar to the Carnero's demographic, but it was that people concentrated where there was water. In arid environments, you got to go where the water is. And so people concentrated in these areas, caused conflict. You've got to organize yourself to make sure that enough people get the right water and all the other sources of like food that are grown from that water. So these are all really great, but which is right? Is it demographics? Is it hydraulics? Is it, there's the big man theory. Maybe what about people's personalities? Maybe one really big, strong leader comes forward and takes charge and says, I'm going to organize us into a state and you're going to follow me. Some people follow him. Other people have no choice. That's the big man theory. Well, as it turns out, a lot of these theories probably have to be combined to build up the best picture of the past. So a lot of these theories that we're talking about here are, especially when we talk about the Neolithic and urban revolutions, are about territoriality, right? So we're going to, in our first chapters looking at the human past, we're going to look at human origins, before there were humans, and then once humans spread throughout the world, right? Now that's not a lot of population pressure at that time. You can just move to the next valley and the next valley and the next continent. But once humans populate the entire planet, which we have, and we're going to look at when that happens, you start to run out of room. And so you've got to sort of negotiate your territory and resources in that territory with other people that are in close proximity. And so this becomes now a survey question. This becomes understanding landscapes. And one person, Thiessen, has come up with a sort of a systematized way of looking at landscapes. And they're called Thiessen polygons, where you can actually look at, just by looking at the size of sites that you see in surveys, you might be able to actually see how a community or a group of communities is organized. That if you've got little clusters of sites, that might be them organized. But is there one that's really a lot bigger than the other? Maybe that's the capital. Maybe that's the one that is sort of got these satellite sites around it. And you see here that is like an idealized Thiessen polygon, which has a city surrounded by towns, and then hamlets surrounded by villages, and then satellite towns with the city at the center of these things, right? Now that's a very hierarchical, organized, idealized system of organization on a landscape. And that tells you something about the social organization. If you see that idealized thing, you've probably got an urban center. That city there controls its whole landscape, all of the resources. Why do all these little satellite things exist? Well, because if you live in the city, how far can you walk to a field and come back that night? So maybe it's better to have little satellites that then ship everything to the center and they get then redistributed. Then we start talking about redistributive economies. We talk about things like taxation and control. We talk about things like beating the system and tax avoidance. So we can then start talking about like social actions that are taking place once we do this. So landscape analysis becomes really important. But the problem is the Thiessen polygon is on a piece of paper. It's flat, it's idealized, it's a concept of what would things be like if things were perfectly arranged in an urban system. But I've got some pictures here that show that that's not the way the Earth is, right? The Earth is linear valleys and deep gorges and limited access to resources or concentrations of resources in here, and maybe another resources way over here. So that sort of shifts where these Thiessen polygons might actually, the lines might be drawn. So you can have actually an urban center in a linear fashion if you're in a deeply incised valley. One way to organize this information by archaeologists is to look at sort of these idealized things in terms of site sizes. And I have a slide here that shows rank size analysis. And this is a logarithmic graphing of site sizes. And there's a peculiar phenomenon that a log normal rank size analysis is essentially that Thiessen polygon, right? That you've seen, that idealized, the rank shows that there is a organized, very scaled distribution of how big sites are in this region. That the smallest one is here, and then the next one is regularly larger and regularly larger and regularly larger, all the way up to the top site. But not all sites are exactly that regular sort of pattern on a log normal. But the variation from that normality can tell you something about the organization. So a convex pattern shows that there is actually a cluster of sort of medium-sized sites. Now there may be one that's larger, but it falls off either the smallest and the largest, and most are medium-sized. Now what would that tell you? Think about it for a second. If most are medium-sized, and there's some that are just a little bit larger and just a little bit smaller, that tells you they're probably not cooperating very much. That they're all kind of equally important to one another. There's nothing that says there's a huge break here, that this bigger site is in control of all these other ones. And that's just from size alone. And these smaller ones are probably not, they may be smaller, but they may not be less important. A primate rank size analysis is kind of the opposite, that you have a cluster of small sites and then you have a big site at the top, and that's the prime site, right? Primate model, which shows that one's definitely dominating all these little ones. They're in control. For them to get that big, they've got to be able to control resources, which probably also means people in these littler villages. And those littler hamlets and villages probably look to the larger location as their leader. And then you have some variations, primo-convex and things like that. So just the size of a site in a survey can tell you a little bit about the way people organize their communities. And that's a big deal, because if you see something go from a convex system in one period to a primate system in another period, hey, you've got an urban center growing, right? That's a big deal. That's village life, maybe just small-scale agricultural communities, to boom, you've got a big city that's dominating the area. And that tells you about social change. Excavation can also do that. But it's got to be done in context. I have a slide here that says context, and this will make no sense to you when you first look at it, and that's kind of the point. These are all contemporary sites in Cyprus, and they all look a ton different from one another. And that's kind of my point, is that There are a lot of, even in the pre-pottery Neolithic period in Cyprus, you've got to look at each individual community, because you might have each village might have, or each community might have a different way, a different lifestyle, right? We've got the oldest wells in the world, which shows that they know how to find water, but that also means that they're probably permanent, right? You have some campsites up in the mountains that are probably hunting camps, but repeatedly gone to. These were things that were occupied repeatedly for many years. You have pit houses that were probably ephemeral, but they came back to those same spots, rebuilt them every maybe year or two, and then left for maybe another location at a different seasonal time of the year. Then you have permanent settlements with walls and maybe multiple stories. And you have wooden structures, stone structures. You have platforms and maybe even monumentality. So you have a lot of different ways of doing things, even in the same time period. So that survey data that I just showed you only tells you site size, but it doesn't really tell you what is happening at each of those sites. So that's where you can ask the next set of questions of survey data. Survey data takes you so far, but you might need to say, all right, I want to really see what one of these small sites looks like. Is this just a camp, or is it a permanent settlement that the primate site is dominating over? Or likewise, it may be a huge site, but how are they organized? Is there a palace or a temple, or is it just a cluster of huts that's just a lot of them? So these answer questions that the simple survey data does not does not answer. So for instance, I mentioned that looking at a big site doesn't necessarily mean that they've got big, complicated social organization. A good case in point that we're going to look at later is Çatalhöyük in Turkey. It's often referred to as the first city. It's not. It's not a city. It's just a big population of people. But they didn't have the kind of social organization that you find in urban contexts. And so that's where urbanization and city life came later. They didn't have streets at Çatalhöyük. They didn't have, all the houses were sort of the same size and the same function. There was no leader. There was no, or at least none that accumulated wealth differently than others. There was no real cooperation or planning of the architecture. So there was a house and someone just built right up next to it, and then up next to that and up next to that. It's what we call agglutinative architecture. And eventually it collapsed probably under its own weight, that they probably couldn't sustain their population because the catchment area that provided the food for this community, probably you couldn't walk far enough to get that food and bring it back by that night. So it was kind of too big for its britches.